Good morning, afternoon to all. My name is Rachel Dax, and I'm a researcher at the Hawaii Institute of Marine Biology. I work within the physical location of the Heʻeia NERR, and I work with the NERR, the NERR team here. I do not work for the NERR though, and I'll be kind of leading the team today on webinar 2 of this series on engaging with cultural ecosystem services across the NERRS. Today's webinar is focused on community volunteer activities. Before we get started, I'd love to see the results of our Menti poll. So I'm just gonna share a different screen here. Let's see, hopefully you can all see that now. Great. So, okay, most folks on the call today, 93% do work with volunteers or provide opportunities for volunteers. Great. I'm glad you all have called in, and I hope that you can find ways to engage with cultural ecosystem services today from some of the examples that we'll provide. What types of volunteer activities occur in your reserve? Education looks pretty big, along with stewardship, citizen science, surveys, taro agriculture. I see education again in there, facilities, visitor centers also being in there. Awesome. And I love thinking about the connections to the examples that we're going to be presenting here today. And then our final question here. So how does your work benefit from the contributions of volunteers? So increased capacity, mentorship, moves the work forward, provide education program, support creative ideas, inspiration, support with our mission. We can't function without them. I think several folks on the call and panelists would agree with that from what I've heard earlier before this call. So thanks so much for playing with us there. I am going to go back to this webinar slide and get started. Okay. Oops. So again, I am Rachel Dax from the Hawaii Institute of Marine Biology. And today I'll be joined with a couple other folks from different reserves. They'll introduce themselves as they come on. And I'm excited to jump into community volunteer activities and how these interact or how they intersect really with cultural ecosystem services. Okay, so just to give a quick outline, this webinar today is scheduled for 90 minutes, but we're going to try to kind of move at most of the content to the first 60 minutes. So we'll start off by introducing CES, quick introduction, and how that interacts with environmental volunteerism. We'll hear from a couple of folks from different NERRS on case studies from volunteer programs in their NERRS. We'll have a closing poll just to see what the next steps might be for you all. And then that's the first 60 minutes. And then we'll open it up to some Q&A and a little bit of a panel discussion. So we hope you're able to join us for the full time. If not, I hope we at least get to poll you before you leave, so we know how this was helpful, or if it was helpful, and how you might use it in the future. Okay, so to get started, if you've tuned into any of our other webinars, you've heard us describe cultural ecosystem services in depth. Today, I just want to ground us in CES, but I don't want to go too deep. So I just want to remind you that cultural ecosystem services are one of the 4 categories of ecosystem services. Cultural ecosystem services are the intangible or non-material ways that the environment contributes to our well-being. And CES, or cultural ecosystem services, this is not an exhaustive list, but they include things like recreation, aesthetics, cultural heritage, identity, inspiration, that awe factor, indigenous and local knowledge, different types of health and well-being, including physical, emotional and mental, religion, spirituality, mindfulness, sense of place, and social relations. Again, this list is not exhaustive, and there are many others as well. Perhaps you've engaged with some of the things on this list before and you're thinking, I didn't call those cultural ecosystem services. And you are absolutely right that these concepts or these connections or relationships that people have with their environment are described in many other frameworks, including human dimensions, nature's contributions to people, reciprocal relationships with nature, biocultural relationships, One Health, and multidimensional well-being. So if you use one of those frameworks, great. And I still think this cultural ecosystem service framework can be useful, and hopefully we can draw some connections. So we know that in the last couple of years, there's been a push within the NERR system to focus more on human dimensions, including cultural ecosystem services. And when I say there's been a push to engage with CES or human dimensions, what I mean by engaging, it could be engaging in order to identify what cultural ecosystem services exist with your communities within your NERR. It could be a little bit more in depth. Engaging could mean assessing or measuring or monitoring either quantitatively or qualitatively. So when I use that word engage, it's really kind of a spectrum of ways that people study or acknowledge or measure or monitor cultural ecosystem services. But why engage with CES? Well, engaging with CES could help inform future visioning or planning, could help monitor ongoing efforts, which I think we'll hear some examples of today. Engaging with CES could help evaluate project or program success, could help us broadly understand the relationships between humans and estuaries. And then finally, it could help build or strengthen relationships with local communities. And as I mentioned in our last webinar, I think beyond the benefits, it's also really important to mention that if cultural ecosystem services or other human dimensions are not considered in our efforts, there may be significant adverse impacts in terms of public support or opposition. So our team has, or some folks on our team have been working together for a couple of years now on CES, and we started some of this in a Catalyst project, and then have continued in this science transfer project, some of the work that we started. And we're really trying to scale up some of the efforts from the Catalyst project. And one of our objectives is really to communicate that many reserves are already engaging with cultural ecosystem services. And even though we know everyone's busy and it's hard to add more to our piles, we're trying to make it obvious that we're to some extent already doing this. And so part of our objective for this project is to make recommendations for operationalizing approaches that engage with CES within existing NERR efforts. And so in this webinar, you'll hear us, or you'll see us highlight some volunteer activities that we already host or participate in. And these are potential opportunities for engaging with CES as well. And so why are we choosing community volunteer activities for this to focus on in this webinar? As I just mentioned, we're trying to identify things that we're already doing that kind of approaches or methods could be easily inserted in to engage with CES. And in speaking with several reserves that have been interested in engaging more with cultural ecosystem services, I heard a lot about reserves already interacting with communities through hosting or participating in a volunteer opportunities. And so again, so these volunteer activities, programs, opportunities are already occurring in most of our reserves. Oftentimes the motivations of volunteers to volunteer, or the benefits that they experience from volunteering, those actually are cultural ecosystem services themselves. And you'll learn more about that as we go through this presentation. And because volunteers' motivations or benefits are often CES related, these are great opportunities to identify, assess, or more deeply understand the cultural ecosystem services of a reserve. And then further, finally, another point I just wanted to mention is that because volunteer opportunities are non-monetary by nature, there are great opportunities to be able to identify or measure the CES from a non-monetary perspective, which is something that folks working on CES are often trying to kind of move in that direction. So away from valuation in dollar amounts as other ecosystem services are. And then finally, so while there's a sizable literature on the benefits of being in nature, there's a lot of papers about being in green spaces and blue spaces. And a lot of people have written a lot also about the benefits of volunteerism. There's a little bit less study on specifically the benefits of environmental volunteerism. But in the literature, the research that does exist, we see that there's documentation that doing purposeful activity in nature, such as volunteering in nature, these activities can help build or strengthen connections to place and connections to nature. They can help provide stress reduction, relaxation, and exercise. Environmental volunteerism can improve people's mood, foster a sense of community, and increase knowledge or learning. I've put a couple of those papers at the bottom there. But there's a lot more to learn. So I think for many reasons, it's valuable and useful to continue understanding the benefits and the motivations of the volunteers in our reserves. And with that, I will pass it on to Wellsner.
Thanks, Rachel, and thanks everyone for being here. I thought I'd share this picture of one of our volunteers, Edie Lamberts, because she is the first face that many people see, she and other volunteers, when they come to the Wells Reserve. At our visitor center desk and at our contact station, these are manned by volunteers and they are the face of the reserve. And I would imagine that's true for some of you other reserves as well. So as we embarked on this part of the project, I put on my researcher hat again, and I thought, all right, how can I learn more about research related questions to volunteerism? Next slide. So my research question was, how do people who volunteer at Wells Reserve experience a sense of well-being from cultural ecosystem services? So you might take that same sentence and think of your reserve or your place of work and ask the same question. Now, I used a couple of different methods, next slide, to get at that research question. In one case, I had some deep conversations over time with our daring volunteer and visitor service director, Lynn, who is at the mic in this photo. Oh, sorry about the phone ringing. And I've been talking to her all summer about the volunteer program at the Wells Reserve. And the second method I used was a very well-known social science technique called the person on the street ambush. It's the same technique that Jimmy Kimmel uses on his show, where he goes down to the street and asks people's questions. So the person I ambushed was our research director, Jason Goldstein, who's on the left in the second picture. And Jason was just unassumedly coming to the headquarters building. And I said, Jason, I have to ask you a research question. So I ambushed him and asked him, why do people volunteer? So some of the things I found out were from conversations with Lynn and some for this quick conversation with Jason. Okay, next slide. So one thing that Lynn did, she looked at that list of cultural ecosystem services, and I asked her, like, what are the top 3 reasons that people volunteer or the benefits they get from cultural ecosystem services? And the way Lynn knows this, it's not just a gut feeling, but she interviews multiple times when someone says they want to volunteer. She interviews them about their reasons for volunteering, and then she stays in constant contact with volunteers over time, cultivating the relationship with the reserve. And from this list of 12, 3 things stood out for her as the dominant reasons. One is for the volunteers' physical, emotional, and mental health. to cultivate a sense of place, and to build social relations. And these were the things, it's not that the others don't exist as well, but these were the top 3 things that came from our data at the Wells Reserve. Next slide. So one of our volunteers is Bruce Bjork, who puts a modest spin on his volunteer service. He says, "It keeps me out of trouble." In the 6 years that he's been a volunteer at the Reserve, he has filled 8 different roles. In his own words, "I'm motivated because I'm retired and I have time to give back." His volunteer service is wide-ranging. It combines his professional skills and lifelong passions. And he is fueled by a desire for social connections with new experiences. The other place I found data at the Wells Reserve on the cultural ecosystem services connection to volunteering was on project pages and blog posts. And you can see the link here. So this story is posted on our Wells Reserve blog, kind of demonstrating to people that might want to volunteer what the benefits are. Next slide. And then who wouldn't want to do this? These are 2 of our research volunteers. They're the polyps, like the fish, and oddly enough, they are studying larval fish. And their story about volunteering really intensified during the pandemic because they'd been coming to the reserve and contributing to a years-long data set of examining larval fish. When the pandemic hit, they could no longer come in. So one of our reserve staff members took the equipment to the Pollock's house, and they set up a lab in their house where they could enjoy wine and enjoy continuing to do the research they did. Now, an interesting story about these research volunteers, when Jason started at the Reserve, there were no volunteers in the research department. So he said, why is this? And he started cultivating an atmosphere that would be receptive to volunteers. And Dr. Pollock, the gentleman on the right, literally wrote the textbook on larval fish. And he is now a volunteer at the Wells Reserve, helping us identify larval fish. Next slide. And here's in Lee's own words. He says, "The research team thinks we're doing them a favor by helping out with the picking and keying. The truth is, we are the beneficiaries. Not only do we feel useful, we get to keep contributing to the important work of the Wells Reserve. We'll get through this bizarre period with the project on track and our sanity intact." Next slide. So one thing I learned from Lynn, this concept, this is a Filipino word, I think, Lynn, you can correct me, Volanesia. It's that moment when you forget you're volunteering to help change lives because it's changing your life. So I felt that was really a strong connection to the effect of cultural ecosystem services on volunteers. Next slide. And then the final connection I wanted to make was with the second research question that you can ask yourselves. How do the actions of volunteers contribute to the mission of the National Estuarine Research Reserve System? And this is an excellent conceptual model of that idea that cultural ecosystem services benefit people. Well, all ecosystem services do, but people can benefit ecosystems, and that's called S2E, or services to ecosystems. So this whole idea of reciprocalness between what volunteers do and what volunteers receive. Next slide. So I hope you'll think of those 2 research questions when you think of your reserve. And here was one of the objectives from the NERRS strategic plan. The objective is to create and enhance volunteer programs that contribute to reserve goals, facilitate outreach, and inspire connections to estuaries and their communities. So, I mean, literally, our volunteer programs are committing to the strategic goals of the NERRS. Thanks, Rachel. And I will turn it over to the Tijuana River program.
Hi, everyone. My name is Megan, and I'm the California Sea Grant Fellow with the Tijuana River NERR. And I also wanted to introduce my colleague, Empress.
Hello, everyone. My name is Empress Holiday. I am a Coastal Training Program Associate and Research Assistant here at the Tijuana River NERR.
Yeah, and today I'm just going to share a bit about the different volunteer opportunities and way we engage volunteers at Turner. And then Empress and I will be here for the round robin and the brainstorming tomorrow to talk about it. The things I like to showcase about Turner is really how we emphasize all our cross-sectoral approaches to our volunteers, but then also we really individualize each volunteer to their special skills and their interests in our showcasing to see how not only we benefit from them, but they benefit with their time and energy that they put into Turner. Next slide, please. So the sectoral approach I find really fascinating because it's really examining not only the needs of our research, the needs of our physical landscape, but also just needs of our community and the best ways to engage. So here you can see different photos of restoration projects and different even researching like minnow trapping and fishing seeing and vegetation monitoring. So these are just different ways throughout the year, either ongoing projects or even specific projects that volunteers are really out there and engaging and doing really hands-on amazing work. And in the photo to the far right, you can see our volunteer coordinator, Robin, working with volunteers and truly as just every day coming to work and seeing folks out in the field, just a true engagement in our land, and not only for how it currently is, but research to ways to improve it and to maintain it. And next slide, please. The next couple, I wanted to showcase a couple of really amazing examples of how we have specific interests and skills of a volunteer and showcase them. So through our education sector, we have docents. And one of the really, really amazing docent opportunities we have is with our longtime volunteer, Ron, who does a nature walk. But his is very unique as it is an eye-opening experience without sight. So you can see Ron here with his guide dog, and he does this a couple weekends a month, and he guides people both who also don't have no to limited sight, or even folks who have full sight, and show them how they can experience Turner with their other senses, with hearing and smell and touch, and seeing how people can enjoy nature just beyond its sight. And I think this is a really like beautiful and interesting example of finding ways that everyone can enjoy and enjoy like the nature we have at Turner. Next slide, please. And going on the other side of the spectrum too, I wanted to showcase Aries. He's 16 years old and he had a great interest in birds. So our Robin, our volunteer coordinator, worked with him and really started to hone in the different expertise and knowledge about birds. Because Turner, we are very special here. We have about 370 species of birds and several endangered species. Right here, you see picture of the ridgeway, light-footed ridgeway whale. And at such a young age, already knowing that he has his passion, it's like, okay, let's create a program for you. You can be a birdwalk docent and you can guide people through our trails to see birds. And this is also a way for someone so young to see like if this is something they want to do with their future and with their career. So I think that's a really also interesting way to think about opportunities we can help support our volunteers. Next slide, please. So in terms of really showcasing like the intersection of CES and volunteering, it's staying engaged, making friends, being part of the community. And I think one really amazing thing Robin said to me as we were talking through this presentation is that it is similar to creating art. An artist only has an idea, but mixed with a medium like clay that has its own will, together the unexpected magic can happen. And I think examples like Aries and Ron, and just saying that tied with passions and skills and interests, you can make really incredible programming. And it's just amazing to see this is people that are volunteering their time and their energy to be part of their community and to learn. And to see here, there's celebrations that happen and just happiness and really a sense of more ownership. So I wanted to conclude our portion with, next slide, please, with specifically a coastal training program. allocated sector. So there is the Tijuana River Action Month, and this happens every September to October, and it physically is supposed to be a time to help prepare the watershed for rain, both in the US and Mexico portion of the watershed, because we are a binational region. But it is every year, this is about to be the 14th installment yet this year, is just such a time of community engagement. It's a time for collaboration. As you can see from our reporting of 2022, last year, we had 17 in-person hybrid events, 22 collaborative partners. You can see their logoing on our posters in the bottom, 864 participants, and then just these events equivalent to over 70,000 pounds of debris removed. Next slide, please. And while this started out as mainly cleanups and ways for people to get out in the community, it slowly also became workshopping and webinars and engagement. And if you can see the bottom, like the mid-bottom photo, that's also tree planting we did in communities in Mexico and schools. So it's not only a moment to clean your community, but it's also to get connected. The watershed is very, very large. As part of the Tijuana River. And some folks don't see how them living in a more desert climate region is connected to the ocean, because it is miles and miles away from them. They don't see it every day. But to explain and to connect with them how this full watershed's connected, and the river goes through to meet, the Tijuana River goes through to meet the Pacific Ocean, and especially these places that are highly impacted by flooding and debris, it's just a time that for people to better understand their region so they can better care for their region as well. Next slide, please. Yeah, so unfortunate that Robin couldn't be here today, but she'd love to answer any questions about volunteering that we have. And like I mentioned, actually this week for the coastal cleanup is going to be the start of this year's Tijuana River Action Month. So if you're interested in all this, we would love to hear from you. Now I'm going to turn it over to our friends at Kachemak Bay.
Thank you, Megan. My name is Sabrina Bentz, and I'm the Coastal Training Program Coordinator at Kachemak Bay Reserve up in Alaska. And I'm here to share about engagement with volunteering aspects of our reserve and connections to cultural ecosystem services on behalf of all the staff here in Kachemak Bay. And the examples I'm going to describe of volunteering will focus on people investing their time and knowledge, and some of those kind of reciprocal relationships that develop through these activities. Sometimes when I think about volunteering, I think about the boots on the ground activities that you can look at and be proud of at the end of the day, like a cleanup or restoring habitat with plantings, or removing invasive species. Here at Kachemak Bay, we don't own or manage any land or resources or have stewardship authority. So we are unlike some reserves in that the activities that result in the improvement of condition of habitat in the reserve may have not day-to-day effects, but long-term impact for achieving our reserve goals. But the results, or the benefits, are those experienced by people in real time rather than the place in real time. Kind of like getting back to what Chris Fort showed in that figure about services to ecosystems and then the ecosystem's benefits to people. Next slide, please. So the first example I'm going to share is about community monitoring. So this is a scenario where we are collecting data for early detection of harmful species that could potentially impact the reserve. And the examples here are showing monitoring to establish presence or absence of marine invasive European green crab. Thank goodness, no marine invasives here yet. And also monitoring phytoplankton for harmful algal blooms that can affect the shellfish in our region. So this is monitoring for early detection and response to harmful species is very important in our region. And we need, we're very large area, so we can't do it all ourselves. We can't cover the entire area of our rural coast. So it's very important for us to have community members contribute to this collective knowledge we're building. There's also real-time benefits for folks for their livelihoods and sustenance. So some of our community monitors are mariculture farmers, or they are tribal community members who are interested in shellfish harvesting and want to know kind of that in the moment information about presence of harmful species for food safety and cultural subsistence issues. But in general too, people do want to know what's out there and build relationships with each other and build that depth of knowledge. So there's can be real-time benefits to some of the CES, like livelihoods and cultural subsistence, but also kind of that longer term preservation of Kachemak Bay as a healthy and productive estuary. Next slide, please. The second example I want to share is of a peat wetland survey. So this is where community members are coming and helping the reserve by collecting and sharing their wetland observations and interpretations. So these kind of observations and interpretations again help us provide broader coverage and get some metrics that we can use for wetland health, especially in our peat wetlands. But we take it a step further and ask folks to do a personal peatland survey. So what are their connections to place? What are their inspirations and feelings about being in a wetland? And then those occasionally too result in the CES of aesthetics. So moving into the art realm and having people express how they feel about wetlands in a different knowledge system. So it's really amazing that people volunteer their observations and interpretations and really contribute to enhancing appreciation of Kachemak Bay as an estuary. For this type of a project, it's both fostering behavior change and a sense of stewardship throughout the community, as well as giving those real-time positive experiences and social benefits for groups of folks going out into our wetlands. Next slide, please. And finally, I do want to mention that we have wonderful volunteers that take the time to educate our community. So this is the 5 spines on either side of the eye. An example of one of our volunteers at a discovery lab sharing with community members. And this idea of the education and scientific knowledge as being a cultural ecosystem in itself, it's really that it provides the basis for both formal and informal education and learning in our community. So we have both volunteers who educate through public events, but we also have volunteers who serve on our advisory bodies. And those advisors bring their knowledge, bring their expertise, and help us really focus the culture of the reserve and maintaining our mission. And that gets to one of the cultural ecosystem services of the quest, or thinking about the importance of maintaining landscapes and seascapes for future generations. And with that, I would just love to think about volunteering and CES in like the kind of the now, next, and future. So all these activities really have benefits for people in real time, for benefits in improving conditions of the reserve in the near term, and for developing that next generation of coastal stewards as well. With that, I'd love to pass it on to our Heʻeia friends.
Aloha mai kako. My name is Casey, and I am the Coastal Training Program Coordinator for the Heʻeia NERR, and I am going to speak about our Laulima Days. So Laulima literally means many hands, but the true meaning of the word is cooperation or joint action, and it really represents people working together. So it's a very fitting name for our regular volunteer service days. Laulima Days are offered once a week, and they rotate between different sites in Heʻeia, where our partner organizations are working to restore the ahupua'a of Heʻeia through a biocultural lens. Our target volunteers are generally researchers and students who are doing research in Heʻeia. We will schedule with our partners to offer just these easy, open opportunities for folks to come and better get to know Heʻeia as a place and the people that work there. So we're really building pilina, or building these relationships for potential future collaborations between those people that steward those places, and then the researchers that we have within Heʻeia too. But there's a lot of kind of knowledge sharing that happens during these opportunities. So the people that participate in our Laulima Days are really working alongside the staff of these organizations that are there. So they're really building those relationships, and they're also just kind of, it gives the researchers a chance to just spend a lot of time in those places. So they're doing a lot of kilo or observation of what kind of different changes happen where the water's flowing, how the weather is influencing what those places look like. So there's a lot of place-based knowledge that researchers are gaining from being in the place, but also from speaking with the staff that are always there and always seeing these changes happen too. There's a lot of really informal networking that goes on. So it's a rare chance for students to just be there in that place with those people without any agenda. So kind of building on those relationships, it's really helpful for them to just be there and not have to set up a formal meeting. And then it's really encouraging co-development and reciprocal research, because, you know, in order to co-develop a research project, it might have to be like, oh, let's set up a meeting and talk about how we're going to co-develop this together. But when we have Laulima Days, you're not taking them away from their work, but you're just, and you're not asking for formal meeting time. But this is a way for us to go to them, help them do their everyday work, and really just kind of not be we all have meeting fatigue, right? So you're not really putting as much of that on them. You're meeting their partner at their place, and learning more just through doing that. And I also just want to emphasize that every time we have a Laulima Day, we're just doing the job that the community wants us to do. So it's not always glamorous. It's not always out planting or harvesting. I know Sabrina and the Kachemak folks know this well, that when they came, we're standing in mud above our belly buttons and just passing debris back and forth. But, you know, sometimes it's just, there's a hurricane coming. We got to tie down some things. We got to, you know, take the tent in. We're all doing that together. So it's really just whatever service is needed to be done on that day to help the organizations that we're with for that day. Next slide. So these are just a few quotes that we had from, we require our NERR graduate assistants to do a certain amount of Laulima Days to make sure that they're giving back to the places that they're doing research in. So these are just a few quotes from their exit surveys. So the first one is just, my relationship with the Heʻeia community has largely been developed through work days and through education programs. These relationships have grown significantly over the past year, and I look forward to continuing to cultivate these relationships. The daily interaction with non-academic people, talking about research in a way that is relevant to everyone and on many different levels. For example, cultural significance of birds as well as their specific role in an ecosystem. Also being able to contribute to some of the restoration activities that are directly benefiting the species I am studying. Being able to stick around the farm and work in the lo'i after collecting data allowed me to learn about the birds and the relationship farmers have with them in a firsthand experience that allowed me to have a deeper relationship to my research. And engaging with community partners has been my favorite aspect of the fellowship and has helped me shape my research motivations and career goals. So in addition to that, we also, in addition to the survey, our research coordinator and our education coordinator do exit interviews with each of our graduate assistants, and a lot of them highlight Laulima Days as one of the big highlights of their research projects. And in addition, we're starting to think about how we can evaluate some of the CES and benefits from Laulima Days through interviews and surveys, so we can monitor how these relationships are being strengthened and how our people who regularly partake in these Laulima Days are really benefiting from them. And I just kind of want to end with saying that we really encourage our students in particular to do Laulima with not just our organizations, but with whatever their community is. So maybe they're not working specifically with our organizations, but they're working, you know, on another island with a different community. Then they should do reciprocal research by making sure that they're giving back to whatever community their research occurs in, and just kind of continue that relationship through volunteer and service. So yeah, that is all I have. And I will pass it to Rachel.
Thank you all. I feel so motivated and I to go do some volunteering myself. But before we kind of wrap up on the slide part of things, I wanted to kind of just distill some of the themes and messages and salient points that I heard from the presentations. And one of them was that volunteer activities exist across all of the NERR sectors. So we heard about examples from research, from the coastal training program, from stewardship, from education. And so a lot of times, I think when we've presented on cultural ecosystem services and ways that they could be identified or monitored, we get a lot of participation from CTP, and people think kind of it's just a CTP thing that can be done. But this is an example. So volunteer opportunities are an example to engage with CES across all sectors. The second one, this got cut off, but the benefits that volunteers experience in reserves, as many of our speakers highlighted, the benefits are the CES themselves. We heard benefits of being connected to place. We heard benefits of being connected to people through networking and social connections, having a sense of purpose, that education, aesthetics and art base. So kind of that benefit of having that inspiration and awe to do art. So again, if you're already doing exit surveys or interviews, or even just talking story, as Chris told us, that ambush method, to understand how your volunteers are benefiting from volunteering at your reserve, you may already be, in a sense, assessing the CES of these volunteers as they interact with the reserve. Volunteers, we heard from a couple speakers, are of different demographics. So some of them are young people kind of getting started on their career path. Some are retired folks. Some are, people in the middle, like graduate students who are kind of on their career path, but still figuring out their research. And so volunteers of these different demographics and life stages, and sometimes cultural and ethnic backgrounds as well, may be experiencing different benefits. And if they are experiencing different benefits, and you are interested in assessing those benefits, it may actually require different methods to get at those. And we can talk more about that if you're interested in the Q&A or during the brainstorm session. But yeah, I hope that came across, that because of these different types of volunteers exist and the different types of benefits they're getting, they might need to be assessed in different ways. And then finally, several of our speakers gave us quotes, and those quotes are from interviews or surveys that they're already doing. And I expect that some of the other folks who tuned in to today's webinar are also doing those. And so you may already be assessing the cultural ecosystem services, again, of your reserve. I hope we're really hammering that hard down, that this is not necessarily something new, but it may be something you're already doing. Okay, so those are kind of some slides. Actually, no, before we go to the Mentimeter, I'm just gonna skip ahead a little bit, because I think it'd be easier this way. But I just want to mention a couple of things that are coming up. So if you are interested in talking more about CES or learning more how you can apply some of these methods or approaches to what you're already doing, we do have a brainstorming session tomorrow. They're kind of like open office hours where we bring either projects that we're working on or ideas that we have that we want to develop more. If you want to join us, you are more than welcome. Same time as today's webinar. Please email me for that Zoom link if you'd like to join us. Also, I wanted to mention that we will be having a professional sharing session at the annual meeting. We've started along this trend, but it's going to be called "Are We Doing It Already?" Celebrating cultural ecosystem services in existing NERR activities and building our community of practice. So we'll be continuing to highlight examples or opportunities that are things that we're already doing, where we can kind of have a chance to go a little bit further to more formally engage with CES. Okay, So now I'm going to move back again, and I hope you will join us on Mentimeter for a poll. And just a reminder that after this poll, we're going to go into our Q&A and round robin. So please stay on the call if you can, because we'd love to hear from you. Okay. And thanks, Nick, for inserting that Menti link into the chat. Okay, so I'm going to move over to our Menti. Might just stop sharing for a second and move over to this closing poll. But yeah, I love this. So we hear community connection, physical, mental health, social relationships, sense of place, citizen science, giving back, the bequest value and networking, connection to nature. Awesome. Sense of place is really strong and social relationships are really strong, which actually, you know, this is something that I think is not intuitive. I think when we think about volunteers volunteering in environmental programs or in nature, I think a lot of people automatically think of more environmental aspects that aren't necessarily these more social aspects. So I think this is a really important point to make and needs more research, actually. Awesome. Okay, second question. How do you evaluate your research or your volunteer programs? And this can be a formal, such as Casey mentioned, doing exit interviews. It can be less formal, like Chris mentioned, the ambush method. Yeah, so how, if you are, again, formally or informally, evaluating or assessing your volunteer programs, how are you doing it? Oh, I see some stuff coming up. Surveys, another survey, interviews, informal chats, group discussions, awesome, discussion with partners, component about their experiencing in their monitoring report. Ooh, I'd love to hear more about that one. Also, I love the answer. Never really thought about it before, but will now. Great, that's the whole purpose of this webinar. Yay. Not sure, also love the answer. Hopefully we've given you some ideas. Awesome. And then I'm gonna move on to our next question. What are you inspired to do or grow with your volunteer programs? So it can either be something that you've learned today or been inspired to think about, or something that you were wanting to work on even before this webinar. Yeah. Great. Always looking for ways to show our appreciation to our wonderful volunteers. I would love to think about ways that you could show your appreciation and at the same time kind of, yeah, it could either be appreciation and that like dovetails on their CES, or somehow being able to identify or monitor or assess CES while you're showing appreciation. That would be a cool thing to think about, perhaps in our brainstorming session. Building out robust professional development for the volunteers in areas of interest. Great. Give it another minute or so here. So aspirations for your volunteer program, whether they're CES related or not. Sharing opportunities between volunteers and growing community in the NERR. Citizen science and projects that give ownership to the community, great. And that sense of purpose is definitely a CES that comes through in some of, sometimes when we understand why volunteers decide to volunteer. Excellent. Well, I'll keep this active if anyone wants to continue thinking about this. I'd like to ask our panelists to maybe turn your videos back on. And I've got questions, ones that I had before this and ones that have kind of emerged as I've heard you all share your stories again. But I'm going to open it up to our broader audience of participants. If anyone has a question they'd like to share or to ask of our panelists today. And if not, that's okay too. Maybe I'll give some time for those juices to flow. But I've got a question I'd love to ask. kind of, it's this one that we just posed to our participants in the in our Menti poll, but I would like to ask you all, you've given us lots of examples of your volunteer programs. So what's the next step? Now that you are in this cohort of CES thinking folks, have you thought more about more formally assessing CES in your volunteer programs, or are there activities that are less formal that are related to CES that are the next steps? You know, Casey referred a little bit to hers. I don't know if she wants to go first. But yeah. Yeah.
Just because I already kind of plugged it, but we're actually thinking of incorporating more monitoring of CES into our La Lima Day program by maybe, instead of just doing kind of exit and entry surveys and interviews, doing something a little bit more regular through interviews or surveys, or even graduate students that aren't really affiliated with the NERR. We have a lot of other graduate students that show up that are just with the University of Hawaii as well. So incorporating some of those voices. We do have a lot of people that don't have that La Lima Day requirement that show up very regularly. So how we can capture what, I guess, how they're engaging with CES by coming to La Lima Days regularly is kind of our next step.
Yeah, I'm going to add a little just because I work with Casey on this. And as Casey mentioned, the participants in the La Lima Days are mostly graduate students. And one of the things that we've heard anecdotally from graduate students is that they love coming to these La Lima, these volunteer work days, because it allows them to get away from their computer. It allows them to kind of, you know, be outside, do some physical activity, and they are kind of they allows them to kind of like mentally offload some things. And for folks in academia or who have been through academia, we know that mental health in graduate school is a pretty large issue. And so one of the aspects of these volunteer days we hope to assess is how volunteering in these restoration work days is supporting graduate students' mental health. And again, mental health and well-being is a cultural ecosystem service. So thanks, Casey. How about others? Any next steps for your volunteer programs related to CES?
Hi, Rachel.
Hi, Lynn.
Hi, I'm Lynn. I work with volunteers at Wells Reserve in Maine. And one of the things that I noticed from the slide presentation that really stood out are the photographs. And this is one way that the NERRS are already documenting. You can see the CES in many of them, groups working together, being active, smiling, happy. And so one of the things that we're all doing, or it seems to be that's important, is documenting through photographs, volunteers at work. I think it's a great way to possibly recruit new volunteers, because they can see what it is that they might be doing and where, and the sense of place. Often when the staff here is taking pictures, you know, it's in the estuary, and it's just the lovely scenery. It's great to see pictures of these other places that so I think that's one of the things to point out. That's really powerful. And one of the things that I'm going to keep doing, that I have been doing, and that's been really fun, is the interviews. So I will interview volunteers when they come in, prospective volunteers. And then one of the things when I started working with volunteers here was to let our staff know who our volunteers were and what they were doing and what they thought. And it's just something that's been really enjoyable. And we're not only sharing volunteer stories with the staff, but also with the larger public through posting it on the blog, or these interviews will appear in some of our publications.
Thanks so much, Lynn. Thanks for bringing up photos, because I know it's something that Wells is really, really good at, using photos to, yeah, to understand a lot of different things. But that's also, these photos is an idea that folks at the Heʻeia NERR and I have had for again, assessing volunteers. And I think it's important to understand too what the photographer sees in a photo might be different from what someone else sees in that photo. So one of the ideas that we had for assessing volunteer days too is to either have participants submit a photo themselves with some sort of caption so we know what that photo represents to them, or providing a photo to everyone and then having them provide us captions like what is this photo that we took during the day that you volunteered mean to you, to then think about yeah, again, what were the benefits for that volunteer, because I think we'd see differences in each participant. So thanks so much for bringing up those photos. Other next steps for other NERRs?
Rachel, I can add on just to, well, if we're waiting for people to think of questions. I really like the idea of the photos as like a collection tool too. So we've made like postcards for people to write to themselves with a photo of the day and the experience. And that's also a way to kind of capture some CES as well, as far as feedback. If people, write down about their experience and then share back with themselves. So I think the next step for me is thinking about creative ways to integrate information collection in a way that feels like culturally responsive and beneficial to participants, as well as beneficial to us as far as understanding about their experience. So yeah, mindful collection of information, making sure that we are acknowledging, intellectual property and data sovereignty as well. Those are all kind of things that are next steps on my list with volunteers. I think additionally, just to think about some of the benefits, I think a real big thing is growing the reserve community and that sense of belonging to place rather than the place belonging to you. So growing the NERR community from our staff to the NERR community is now our volunteers, and that sense of identity is really important. And with that, this kind of goes back to the celebrations webinar a little bit, is how is this growing community helping share about the story and the value of the reserves in dimensions that aren't just, economic or provisioning or some of those, ecosystem services that we talk about decision-making happening around. So really elevating that cultural ecosystem services are something that we should be paying attention to in our day-to-day decisions about what we do in these places.
Thanks. Tijuana River, did you have anything you wanted to add for kind of your next steps or thoughts for growing your volunteer programs, or how you want to, or how they're evolving or changing, or ideas that you might have?
Yeah, I can speak a little bit more on the CTP side, and if Empress wants to give a little bit more insight on the research and education side. But I see it as the way, especially coming out of this very large Ranger Reed Leadership Academy that we talked about in the first webinar. And as we go into our communities, especially with this binational context and how intertwined we are with our community, and we really holistically are never just talking about the estuary, we are talking about the full watershed. I think just the engagement and just the level of, because we've had quite a few times where everyone's really seeing the sensitivity, environmentally speaking, for example, with the potential of Hurricane Hillary in our region and the flooding that would have happened with that. It's just everyone's noticing how sensitive our ecosystem is, and that level of care and that level of responsibility from our community is just increasing. So finding ways to approach that and to have really meaningful either workshopping and then cleanups, like finding ways that we can intersect that education of what's going on, but in a way that people still can interact and feel like they have a sense of responsibility to the region. I've found that really meaningful. But I think it's interesting, speaking of like integrating more of that like evaluation and evaluation aspect of CES, and how to see that, how to integrate that. That's the part that I'm finding really interesting if we can brainstorm more.
Yeah, I'd also say that in terms of the process of onboarding volunteers, they go through a pretty rigorous volunteer training. And then it's either extended or ended depending on their interests, whether they want to become docents or just become stewards working with stewardship and things like that. But in that process, touching more on ecosystem services, I think would be very beneficial. That falls under our stewardship and education sector that takes on the training there. But I think there's definitely room to inject that in terms of how we go about talking about those services here. And that also is largely because I think Lynn had mentioned earlier that they are, Lynn or Christine, I'm so sorry, but I heard it. Someone had mentioned that our volunteers are kind of like the faces of the reserve. They interact with the public on this day-to-day basis, or they're interacting with students, you know, where we aren't. So this is kind of also like an opportunity to extend this knowledge out just past us here. So in our training, I could definitely see us including a little bit more on talking about this and those intangible benefits, and maybe even reminding them why they're going through this training in the first place, and to keep them excited.
Thanks. And Megan, I appreciate what you said about kind of realizing that there's this increasing desire to care for your watershed and how you're channeling that or that's something that you've noticed into your workshop. So I think that's a great example of my next question, which is, if we were doing this, like we had, you know, wonderful ways to assess our volunteers, to know what benefits they're experiencing, to know their motivations, why they want to volunteer. So say we all had these programs in place to do that in whatever way was appropriate for your place and your volunteers. What would we do with that data? How is it helpful? And I think, Megan, you gave us a great example, like you would use that to inform your workshops, right? So that's kind of an example of how you would use an understanding of cultural ecosystem services to guide your programming, right? How else might we use this information? How might it be useful for us in your reserve or at the, you know, system level, or whatever you all are thinking of? And Sabrina, you started giving us a taste, I think, of an answer too, like, so a non-monetary, but how is that useful? Like, what is it? What can we do with it?
Yeah, and I want to credit Chris for thinking about this as another system-wide monitoring program for the reserves as well. So how does this move us forward in understanding human dimensions of the reserve? So, you know, another part of our vision is where human and natural communities thrive. So is this a way for us to really step into that human dimensions realm and become a better platform for that research and data collection, to really understand both the biophysical as well as the social factors that are driving health of our systems? So I think that's one thing, is better engagement with social science and social science researchers, as well as better communication about, you know, the things that people actually care about and that contribute to people's well-being and the reasons they live here and the reasons they have relationships to place. So honoring, you know, what people are telling us about their experience and helping elevate that into decision-making structures, I think is the biggest one for me in the coastal training program realm, because as we design our technical assistance or our training and our collaborative workshops with decision makers, I think if they're only getting one slice of the ecosystem services package, they're not seeing, you know, the whole thing. And so this is a way for us to educate ourselves so that we can educate others as well.
And so, kind of put a different way, and correct me if I'm wrong, Sabrina, but I think you're suggesting that monitoring or assessing cultural ecosystem services is another way to measure the NERR's progress on their mission, right? If the mission is to support thriving natural or I forgot what the ecosystems and people thriving, I forgot what exactly the words are, but we're it sounds like the NERR is doing a great job of measuring a lot of the biophysical elements of the system to report on the thriving ecosystem, right? But how are we reporting progress on that mission of the human, the people part of it, right? So I think that's, in my mind, that's what I heard you say a bit in a different way too. Yeah, if that's correct. Thanks. Other ways, data on this, if we had perfect data, all this data, what would we use it for? Other thoughts?
It might help. It might help when gathering data to understand how to retain volunteers, volunteer retention, and how cultural ecosystem services, the relationship between retaining volunteers and CES.
Yeah.
I mean, I have a sense that building cultural ecosystem services into a volunteer program through education and opportunities for social time with other volunteers would make volunteers want to continue volunteering. But how to make that formal, how to establish that formally, it's interesting to me. Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, and I think it's retaining, but also what you were talking about earlier, Lynn, with the photos, a way to advertise, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you can advertise that volunteering with the NERRS, you can get all these benefits. It's a way to, retain, but also recruit new volunteers as well. And I know it's definitely an interest, at least of one of our partners in Heʻeia NERR, is to know this information so that they can better retain and advertise for a larger volunteer base.
And also to help us to know if we need to build in other aspects of CES. We have some volunteers here in Wells who they volunteer in visitor services. So they work in the visitor center or they work in our admissions booth. We charge an admission certain months of the year, or they walk the trails as rangers. They're not necessarily getting education in the research department or interacting with the research staff or CTP. But one of the things that we decided to do for volunteers in general, but open it up to these visitor services volunteers, is we did something called Coffee in the Lab with Scientists, which was like an open house, inviting all volunteers into the lab to meet and hear about research projects, with the idea that all volunteers are interested in the mission of the reserves and the projects that are happening. And if they know about it, they're getting education, but they're also getting social interaction. They're getting access to the staff, and they're also able to talk about projects and the mission with visitors in a way that may inspire visitors and create visitor CES, I guess, or community cultural ecosystem services. Like, what is the connection between volunteers and the CES, and then that transferring to visitors? Like the story from NERR about Ron, and that picture of the volunteer who is providing that tour of the other senses other than sight. Just seeing that picture and seeing Ron with members of the community, with visitors, and sharing, or generating cultural ecosystem services sense of place, and with visitors as well. So it's passing that on.
And to add to that, Lynn, I was actually going to mention Ron's tour specifically, but also Aries' tour. Both of them were visitors. Ron is a longtime visitor here. He's a community member. Him and Gidget, that's his guide dog, know these trails very intimately. And that kind of fosters this his sense of ownership over the place, and that kind of comes through on his tour. His tour is fantastic, and he talks about this space as if he lives here, which he does. He lives like down the block. But that's something that we really try to build up where we can. And so part of our training process is where Robin sits down with each volunteer that's interested in coming and has a conversation and says, what are your interests? What do you want to do here? And through that process, we can kind of better organize where they want to go and what they want to do, which not only can give us better data with research, on the system here when we're doing our monitoring, but then that can also then provide us with a wider option of how to educate our community or how to just simply work with them by saying, hey, now we have a program on this if you're interested. For example, in addition to Ron and Aries, we also have a volunteer who's very specifically interested in bats and how bats act as pollinators here at the reserve. So now that's a question of offering a night tour, which is not something that's offered in any of the reserves or any refuge around here. So now you're creating this kind of like niche area, but again, really fostering that sense of community. Most people have no idea this place even exists. There's many, many different layers to the city that we're located in terms of being near the border and things like that. Most folks wouldn't venture their way here, but trying to kind of really reach out into the community by offering these very unique experiences and broadening our community in that way. Our volunteers and our information ambassadors is what we call them. They're the ones who really help us do that, right? We can only do so much, but kind of this very intimate experience walking the trails with them, having them put their fingers on these plants and say, feel this, smell this, hear this. That's something that only they can do. So having that data would definitely go into future visioning and planning of what kind of programs we can offer.
Great. And something else I'm kind of hearing from you all as you're describing these benefits too, especially building community and some of these like outside exercise types of things, mental health, some people have spoken about, but this is public health, right? And so it's almost kind of like how the NERR is contributing to public health. And if we're able to communicate that as individual reserves or as a system, I know that's not something that we necessarily have expertise in all of our reserves in, but if we're able to communicate the contributions that we're making to public health, that's really a different aspect that hasn't necessarily been communicated. But if you are able to communicate that, it really can open different funding structure. It can make yourself probably more attractive to other collaborators, and really attracting different types of volunteers and participants in your programs as well. So I think that's another benefit too. Well, do any other panelists have questions for each other or anything that's come up? I've opened the stage to participants who are on the call. I've had my own questions, but now any other panelists have any other questions for each other or for our participants even? Sabrina?
I have a slight thing that might be a tangent, but I think is interesting, and just kind of hearing what you all are saying, like the activities we're doing are with volunteers and with cultural ecosystem services, like they have tangible benefits and outcomes for like our habitats and our water quality, but we're moving towards that like condition, like long-term outcomes for place. But I think that what's interesting to me is that a lot of this helps focus our attention on the conditions of people. So like you're saying, Rachel, public health, human health, well-being, community building, relationship building between people. And so I wonder, when we're thinking about evaluation too, when we're talking about our next project, a lot of time our metrics are focused on stewardship metrics of the place, but not as much about stewardship of our people and our communities. And I think this is really revealing to me on how important those are, as far as maybe just as important outcomes or outcomes along the way to get to the health of a place is to think about health of people and community as well. And it's reminding me a little bit of the Neuroscience Collaborative, working a little bit around ripple effects of activities. And so some of those benefits that we're not actually measuring or focused on as being maybe the best parts about some of the things that we do. So it's just really exciting to me to really focus on the people. And I think CES is a great way to highlight that.
Thanks, Sabrina. Okay. Well, with that, if there aren't any other questions or comments, I I think I'll thank everyone for joining us. Thanks to our panelists, so many rich stories that you shared that I'm inspired by, and I look forward to trying to figure out how to integrate them into my ways forward. So thank you all. And reminder, if anyone wants to join us for a brainstorming session tomorrow, please email me at I'll put my email in here again. Otherwise, I will see you all at the annual meeting or when we next meet. So thank you.